4 years, Turkey has become a country with the largest number of refugees in the world.
The war in Syria has caused one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of our time and Europe's biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul with the third part of TRT World's week-long special coverage of Syria's conflict. Coming up in today's programme then, Europe's borders closing one by one. We report from a camp in Greece where thousands of Syrians are stranded as Macedonia says no entry. Plus the tale of two refugee communities, why the arrival of so many Syrians is upsetting Palestinians who've lived in this camp in Lebanon for years. And starting over, we meet the Syrian refugee who started a successful restaurant chain here in Istanbul. This is Syria, 5 years of conflict, the refugee crisis. The conflict has forced more than half of Syria's population from their homes. 6.6 million people are internally displaced. That means they're living in Syria, but they've fled their own areas. And almost 5 million people have fled the country. Among them, almost 1 million have sought asylum in Europe. Thousands have died trying to find a better life. Most Syrian refugees leave Turkey's western coast crammed into inflatable boats. They cross the Aegean Sea, hoping to reach a Greek island. Once they reach Europe's gateway, they move north, trying to cross Macedonia and on through to Serbia. But the Macedonians have now shut their border. Hungary has built a razor-wire fence, diverting refugees to Croatia. They then try to cross Slovenia, which has also closed its border, before facing Austria's fence. And if they manage to make it this far, the vast majority of refugees end their journey in Germany. We have correspondents along the refugee route. Let's begin where many first touch European soil, the Greek island of Lesbos. Sally Ihan reports.
At first glance, there's not a lot that's new here. Another refugee camp spilling with people living in squalor, desperate to move on. Most at this camp, deemed economic migrants, never will. Across the way, spirits are higher, and Syrians are contemplating a new life in place of their old. 13-year-old Bilal was separated from his parents when he left Damascus.
My big dreams is peace. I want peace. I don't like war.
The EU and Turkey are trying to finalise a deal that would allow European countries to send back refugees before they seek asylum. EU leaders say they want to protect refugees and clamp down on smugglers exploiting the exodus. But human rights groups are concerned.
This is a refugee emergency, and we shouldn't allow Europe to be in a crisis of solidarity alongside this refugee emergency. We need to see a rapid response that's based on solidarity from all the EU member states working together to help Greece.
Almost 140,000 refugees have arrived in Greece by sea this year, and more than 400 have died or gone missing. Here are rows of new modest plots, simple dirt mounds with tombstones with Greek and Arabic stating the person's name, the day they died and their age. 1-year-olds to 60-year-olds are buried here. As people continue to cross by boat, graves will continue to be dug. But people are still less fearful of being sent back than they are of staying forever.
Let's move to the next leg of the refugee journey now, the border between Greece and Macedonia. Macedonia has shut its borders and turned people back to Greece if they do manage somehow to cross into its territory. This is causing tremendous hardship for many people. Natasha Exelby reports from a makeshift camp in Idomeni where thousands of refugees are stranded.
Camped in a muddy farm field in Idomeni, Adnan and his family are cold, wet and hungry. But he has no regrets because he had no choice.
We fled from war. There's no peace anymore in Syria. There are terrorists. There's Daesh, there's the YPG, there's the Assad regime, there's al-Nusra. You don't know if you're going to die in the next minute.
40% of the refugees in this camp are children.
I'm going to Germany so my children can have a decent future. I don't care about my life. My life is gone, but I'm very concerned about the future of my children. They need to study. They need to learn. They couldn't go to school for the past 5 years.
More than 40,000 refugees are stuck in camps around Greece after Macedonia closed its border. Every border in the Balkans is now shut, leaving these people in limbo.
Greece says it's planning to build another 10 refugee camps, but there's no timeline on that, which means that the people here are not only having to cope with the dire conditions, but they also don't know how long it will be for or where they're going to next.
So for now, they're doing everything they can to make this grim life feel like home. Local Greeks have set up markets on the outskirts of the camp. This camp was supposed to be a stop on the way to Northern Europe, but now it's almost turning into a town.
I go from the camp to the market to buy some vegetables for my children. You have to queue for 5 hours to get a small sandwich.
Days of despair have turned into weeks, but that desperation has sparked determination, courage and resilience to reach a new home and begin a new life.
And Natasha is now live for us in Idomeni. Natasha, thanks for joining us again. We just wanted to ask you about the people we've seen over the past few days wading through the cold river to get into Macedonia. They've been rounded up, they've been stopped. What has happened to these people?
Well, essentially, Matt, their brave attempts have been futile. They have been put right back at the camp here in Idomeni. They were met by a fair bit of force from police and other military. They told us that they were forced into trucks and also beaten. We met one man who had broken his hip, another who had broken his arm, and he said that the police were responsible for that. Some of those people were bused directly here to the camp. Others were dropped off at a certain point and they had to walk for kilometres, and we're talking about people who are elderly, people with prams, all sorts of things. Speaking with aid workers here today, Matt, their biggest concern is that this is not going to be the only kind of hostility, and that there is more to come, because essentially the Greek government is asking people to relocate, but unless the people here, whether the border opens or they're going to be relocated somewhere in Northern Europe, they're not going anywhere without a fight.
There's a big refugee summit coming up in the next couple of days. If the people behind you could have a seat at the table, what is it? What is their priority right now? What would they want to see come out of this summit?
Well, as you mentioned, ultimately they do want to get to Germany or somewhere within Northern Europe. Everywhere you go, people are just saying, just open the border, just open the border. We don't want to stay here. We want to get to Germany, and we know that there seems to be places for them there, and that Germany is still happy to receive them. So there's also the rumour mill, Matt, is running wild about what's going to happen next, because there's only probably about a dozen or so UN workers here, and we're talking about around 12 up to 14,000 people. So people aren't getting enough information. So every day we're hearing different things about, oh, planes are arriving to come and get us, or no, they've changed their mind and they are going to open the border, or oh, we're going to meet up with these people smugglers and they're going to take us through Albania and Italy and then onto another route. No one has any clear idea on exactly what is going to happen here. So it will be very interesting to see what is going to come out of that summit. But I think that if there were 3 words that these people behind me could say, if they had a seat at that table, it would be open the border.
Natasha X will be live in Idomeni for us. Thank you. Well, for most Syrians, Germany is the preferred destination. More than 400,000 of them applied for asylum there in 2015. Dominic Valitas is in Berlin and looks at the impact they're having on the country.
It's rarely quiet at Berlin's main registration centre for refugees. These Syrians are just the very latest who've come to Germany looking for a better future.
I am engineer telecommunication. and I will try to stay here and make good future for my family.
I will stay here and study in university or something, and when my country is good, I will come back.
Of course, caring for so many costs money. After all, refugees need housing, feeding, schooling, and even job training if they're to be properly integrated into German society. Estimates vary, but the very latest study suggests that refugees will cost the German government around $55 billion over the next 2 years.
The huge influx of people, more than 1 million last year alone, is testing the limits of German efficiency. Some economists, though, say the country can afford it and point to the economic benefits refugees will bring once integrated. What is harder to quantify is the political impact. The right wing has been on the rise since Chancellor Angela Merkel announced her open-door policy on refugees. Last weekend's regional elections resulted in the right-wing anti-immigration AfD party making significant gains.
Results show the polarization in our society, because you cannot just focus on the gains on the right. You can also see that most candidates who supported Merkel's policies on refugees had also significant gains.
Although Syrians are just one part of Germany's refugee story, they are the largest. Their presence in the country is testing the EU's biggest player both politically and economically. A gamble on Merkel's part perhaps, but one that could pay off if Germany's government delivers on integration. Dominic Velitis, TRT World, Berlin.
Well, thousands continue to attempt the journey. Here's a reminder of what they face along the way.
this to find another kind of this. This is in brief. Here, the situation here is we are dying, but slowly.
Dying but slowly, as Europe still debates how to handle the crisis. Earlier I spoke to Jan Egeland, who is the Secretary-General of the Norwegian Refugee Council and was recently appointed by the United Nations to coordinate aid deliveries inside Syria. I asked him what he thinks about Europe's response.
I don't think Europe is doing enough to help people fleeing to Europe and within Europe. My own organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, has sent a lot of experts that is helping the United Nations to do more work within Greece and also in the Balkans. Many of us NGOs are also in place and doing good work. But it should be possible for Europe, 35, 14 nations, trillions of euros economy. We have 500 million people. We should be able to tackle, the influx of 1 or 2
But you're in charge of getting aid to the Syrian. You're in charge of getting the aid to Syrian refugees, and you represent the United Nations. What I'm asking is, what is the United Nations doing about that situation on the border?
I'm in charge, yes, of trying to get into the besieged areas of Syria. The High Commissioner for Refugees is trying to get Europe to do its job within Europe, and there is a high-level meeting now of ministers. I think the United Nations expect Europe to be cooperating in tackling the European crisis and not closing borders and making problems for each other. What we may end up with here are permanent refugee camps in Greece and elsewhere in Europe, and that would not look good.
In a previous interview with TRT World, you talked about a Marshall Plan for Syria, referring to the US plan to rebuild Europe after the Second World War. What kind of money and commitment are you talking about, and where would it come from?
Well, I would say that all of the industrialized countries, all of the countries with a surplus economy, and there are many, many, Europeans, North Americans, Southeast Asia, China, Russia, should be investing much more in the neighboring countries to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq and Turkey, so that education is given to all of the children, and there is also given job opportunities for Syrian refugees. Then, of course, the big Marshall Plan would be the rebuilding of Syria. But to enable that, we need to have some degree of peace, some agreement between the parties. It would be hundreds of billions of dollars that is needed to rebuild Syria, but also to give hope to the 4.5 million Syrians in the neighboring countries.
I just want to put something to you that Germany's Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development said a couple of months ago. He suggests it's better to support refugees in the region because a dollar goes further there than in Europe. Would you agree with that?
Well, indeed, the way of helping refugees is as close as possible to their homes. The best is to help them before they have to flee. It's better to help them within Syria if it's safe there. But it's not safe in most places of Syria up until now. That's why they've gone to the neighboring countries. The neighboring countries are in general now overwhelmed. So it's not possible for Europe to say, we will send a lot of checks, money to the region. We also have to take refugees to Europe. But the best way of doing that is through quotas, so that those with greatest needs are given priority, and not that people have to risk their life to cross over in a haphazard way.
Okay, let's talk about one of the proposals for one of those neighboring countries, the European proposed deal with Turkey, whereby Syrian refugees who enter the European Union in an illegal or irregular way will be sent back to Turkey, and in return the EU will take a Syrian refugee who's completed the asylum process. Do you have any reservations about this deal?
Well, yes, because I think that the right of seeking asylum is a sacred one. So we cannot negotiate our way out of people being able still to seek asylum in Europe. What I think is would be correct is that Turkey takes back those who are migrants and that have no protection need. I also like the idea that Europe should take more Syrians that are in Turkey and the other neighboring countries to Europe, but I don't like at all that it seems to be more difficult for even Syrians and others to seek asylum in Europe. That is a right for them, and we should uphold it.
Well, the vast majority of refugees are living in the countries that border Syria. Turkey has the largest number of Syrian refugees, about 2.7 million. War-torn Iraq hosts at least 210,000, mostly in camps in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and the number could be as high as 400,000. Jordan is currently home to at least 600,000 refugees from Syria. And Lebanon has more than 1 million Syrians out of a population of just 5 million. That means 1 in 5 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. And the war next door has overwhelmed the country's infrastructure and changed many of its neighbourhoods. Nowhere is this felt more than in the Palestinian refugee camp. People there are among the most impoverished in the country. And as Zaina Awad reports, tensions are rising between the camp's original inhabitants and some of the newcomers.
When they first came from Syria, many were Palestinians who again found themselves as refugees. And people living in Shatila camp on the outskirts of Beirut welcomed them. But soon enough, space started running out.
There were 20,000 people living here even before the war in Syria begun. It's a cramped space and people aren't allowed to build. And in the last 5 years, that number has doubled.
Cut off from the rest of society, Palestinians here rely on charities to survive.
Refugee camps have had social and economic problems, and this has gotten worse. Before we used to deal with, say, 50 people, but now we have to deal with 100. We don't have the capability and the resources to be able to continue.
And it's not only resources that are running short, it's also jobs. Palestinians are banned from working in more than 70 professions. And even in areas where they can work, they now face stiff competition from newcomers like Fadi. He told us he gets paid about $20 a day, but a Palestinian from Lebanon can earn double that.
They see that many of us have come here and they are taking advantage of us. People need to live. They've escaped war and they have families, so they're forced to work at these rates. If you don't work, you can't feed your family.
And as work dries up, Lebanon's original Palestinian refugees say they are now finding it harder to put food on their table. Haifa says her son Yassine is among those struggling to find a job.
Shops would tell him, we have no openings, we already have workers. We can't hire you because we have a Syrian worker who earns less than you. Just like we're uncomfortable with Syrians here, Lebanese are uncomfortable with us Palestinians being in their country.
A dividing line created by the war in Syria has emerged between these two refugee communities. And now both of them are scrambling for the little that's available.
And Zaina joins us live now from Beirut. Zaina, we heard in your report there some of the refugees saying they felt they were being taken advantage of. Is anyone in Lebanon responsible for keeping an eye on these refugees and making sure they're treated fairly?
Well, the United Nations is responsible for the refugees, but there are sort of two systems at play here. Palestinian refugees, be they Palestinian Lebanese or Syrian or Palestinian Syrian, fall under the remit of UNRWA, which is the UN agency created in 1949 specifically for Palestinian refugees. The Syrians are under the remit of UNHCR. And their situation is a little bit complicated because there are no refugee camps that are specifically for them. When it comes to UNRWA, there are some issues. There have been a lot of issues in the last couple of years because the money is drying up. UNRWA is running a deficit, the highest in its history, and it's had to slash many of its services. Palestinians now have to pay up to 20% of their medical bills. Teachers are being laid off, and subsidies are being cut. They're very angry with UNRWA. They're saying it's not providing enough. And the Syrians, the refugees from Syria, are saying that if they're not registered, then UNHCR won't support them in any way, shape, or form. And when we were in the camp, the people there were very critical of the UN, but they were also critical of international donors and international organizations because they're saying that these international organizations are running two parallel tracks. They have programs for the Syrians, they have programs for the Palestinians. That's only separating the two and creating more tensions between them.
Zaina Awad in Beirut, thank you very much for that report. Now, the war in Syria has driven away many of its brightest people, but some refugees have managed to make a new start to their lives. Azar Sukri met one such businessman here in Istanbul.
It's another busy day at Mohammed Nizar Bitar's restaurant. Mohammed fled the war in Syria in 2011 after losing almost everything he had, including a thriving mosaic tile manufacturing business.
I haven't now anything. I have a factory, two factories, one in Damascus, one in north of Syria in Idlib. Mosaic, and it's go and it's finished.
With help from his fellow Syrian refugees in Turkey, he set up Tarbush, selling classic Syrian fare. Mohammed now has 7 such restaurants, with plans for another 5 by the end of the year. He also has 2 bakeries. All of the staff and many of the customers here in Mohammed's restaurant are from Syria. There's a close bond within the community. But mostly the people are here because the food is just so good. Mohammed's not the only Syrian entrepreneur who's found success in Turkey. Syrians established 30 new businesses in 2010. By 2014, that number had surged to more than 1,200. And last year, Syrians helped set up almost 1,600 new businesses. One of Mohammed's partners says he lost his leather import business in Syria and is grateful for the opportunity he's had to re-establish himself.
I was really hurt by the war. They burnt my storage units down. My partner and I lost $2.6 million worth of goods.
Turkey is home to nearly 3 million Syrian refugees. Most of them are still trying to return to a semblance of normality. Despite his success here, Mohammed would one day like to return to Syria. But he sees only bleak prospects there for the foreseeable future. Like other Syrians here, Turkey is home for now. Azhar Sukri, TRT World, Istanbul.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of our special programme on the refugee crisis sparked by the war in Syria. On Thursday, we'll examine the main factions fighting in the country. But for now, we'll leave you with some poignant scenes from the struggle that Syrians endure to get their families to safety.